much for joining us. So today we're going to talk about implementing a smart culture of risk. So as the general counsel here, of course, this is a topic that's very, very warm to my heart. And we're going to talk about how to evaluate risks, how you make hard decisions, and really how to create a smart culture of risk within your organization. So just to kick things off, maybe each of you can just tell us what does it mean to you, what does risk play in your job on a day-to-day role?
Sure, I would love to. Thank you, Nithya. I run the corporate development group for WPP in North America, and what that means every day is evaluating and making judgments and recommendations on how we spend the company wallet on acquisitions and on investments in companies across the board, from creative agencies to social media, technology firms, to the investment we have in AppNexus. So it spans the gamut of marketing and media. The fundamental risk element of my role is spending money. Will we see that capital back? Will we make a return on that capital? It's a fundamental part of WPP's model to deploy capital in this way, but every deal, investment, acquisition that we do has to be measured on its ability to return the shareholders' capital. So that's the common denominator for risk for my role.
Sure. So I'm Denise Colella. I run data strategy and platforms for NBCUniversal. And risk from my particular role is quite different, but at the end of the day, it really comes down to how what you're doing affects the overall strategy of NBCU and our ad sales. So on a daily basis, we're starting to look at how we take data and use that to inform our advertising to make it better perform for our advertisers. But this is something that's relatively new, especially on the television side. So the risk really comes about: how do we acquire that data? How do we process it? And how do we use it in a way that we continue to grow with our advertisers but not alienate them because they're not used to necessarily buying in this way for television? And then looking forward, we're always looking at how do we bring the digital side of the house and the television side of the house closer together. And as you can imagine, when you have people who have done one or the other for a significant amount of time, you don't want to alienate them. You want to bring them along. And as Irene said earlier, you want people to follow you. So there's a lot of risk in either moving too fast or not considering people's opinions or positions or use cases. So the risk is more, it's less about the financial in my particular position and more about the people that you're working with and how do you rally support for something that's very new to the organization.
Sheila, when you're thinking about risk in the context of an M&A deal or an investment, do you have a framework that you use as you evaluate what the risk for that particular opportunity is?
I try to boil it down to sort of simple categories. Are the risks in an opportunity inside risks inside the company that we're looking at, or are they outside risks that are driven by competition, innovation, technology, regulation? So inside and outside. And then the other dimension I look at, is this a standard, normal doing business risk, or is this some sort of special, unique, exogenous, non-ordinary course risk? Because I would tackle those in two really different ways. Part of my role is to understand how to evaluate normal operating risks. It's when you get things that are coming out of left field that you've never seen before, that's when you need to be creative about how to tackle understanding those new risks that you haven't seen before. But I think it's a part and parcel of my role and my team to really dig into normal course risks, like client concentration, key person dependency, competitive technologies. All of those are things that are part of our daily bread. But other things like regulatory change or litigation, those are unusual and really require a different approach.
Denise, what you do, it's interesting. It's sort of a little bit different because it's more it's more about the innovation, and so you must often find yourself dealing with sort of the unknown. How do you get comfortable when there are facts or pieces of the equation that you just don't know?
Sure, I think when you're involved with innovation, you have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? But there is a certain level of comfort that you need to achieve and also communicate out to the stakeholders. And the way we go about that is really looking, one, what else is going on in the industry? Are we the first person to do this? If not, how has it affected their business? If we are the first company to be doing this, then what are the different pieces of the business will it touch, and what do we think the effect will be? So we may not have all the answers, and there's certainly no equation that we can just plug numbers into to evaluate it, but we can look and project on how these different changes, whether it's a product or a certain kind of data that we'll be using, where that will end up. And we spend a lot of time looking at that, talking to people about their perception, where things are going. And we then at the end of the day, you just have to make a best guess on the most data you can assemble. And like I said, you're not always going to be 100% comfortable, but you need to have a certain belief and passion that you can convey to others so that they'll join you. Because the worst thing that you can do is go into it with a fractured set of stakeholders, and then you're destined for failure, because no one will believe in your process, they won't support you, and then it's bad for everybody involved.
So you've each been at your organizations for a different period of time, and when we had talked about this, one of the things that I thought was really interesting was, how do you go about understanding what the risk appetite for your organization is, and knowing how far you can go?
I wish that when I showed up in my job at WPP, they just put a manual on my desk and said, if it's this much risk, turn here. If this much risk, turn there. And if it's over the top, just put the file away and don't look at it again. But they didn't give me that manual, unfortunately. But the happy side for me is that in the role that I'm in, it's really a central function in the company to put capital out in this way. And so we become a little bit, how should I put it, like experienced in tackling risk and assessing risk in businesses that are in our world. And so over time, you can understand the tolerance, the typical risk issues, what our process is to investigate and really run down the magnitude of a risk. And over time, and I've been at the company for 8 years, and I've probably done 60 transactions for the company. Over time, I have really calibrated where the company and where the executives are willing to go, and where they're going to really rely on my judgment on a certain risk decision. But there are always those challenges that come up that are really out of left field and necessarily, by their nature, outside of your comfort zone. And that's when what's expected of me is to use all the available resources, not to be constrained by, who's in my immediate purview. I work at a really large company. We have a ton of experts around the world in so many different things. And my role is to go and find those people who know something and can go give me more insight to measure a risk. And so engaging the organization and networking, knowing who to call is really important, especially when you get a new problem. And new problems do come up pretty regularly.
So I moved across to NBCUniversal about 6 months ago from a startup. I was still looking in my desk for that manual. It's not there. So when I was coming into NBCUniversal, it was a very big change coming from a startup. But one of the things they said is that we want you to come in and be the risk taker. We want you to be the innovator. And they said not everyone's going to be happy with that. Right, so I have an interesting element of my job, which is encouraging risk and almost pushing risk into the organization in some areas where they didn't have it before. So in the same way you do, Sheila, in many ways I have to go out and find these little pockets of people who have some expertise or who are willing to try new things to create that risk-taking environment and try to push that culture out further through the organization. It's not easy, but it's something we have to do if we're going to continue to innovate and stay current with the way that our industry is changing.
Okay, so you each have your framework. Sheila, you've now written the manual, right? And how do you, so you're building teams under you though, and you're in these leadership positions where, how are you actually developing this same risk muscle, this risk decision-making muscle within your teams?
Well, I definitely rely on my team to do a ton of the critical thinking and investigative reporting, if you will, on any situation, both the opportunity and the risk. And so much of our conversation here is about risk, but we also spend a lot of time thinking about upside and opportunity and revenue growth as well. But I have a team of people who work for me, and we sit down and we talk about what's important in understanding the downsides, the risks, what could go wrong. And we lay out a map of what questions to ask and who to ask them. And my team is responsible to go out and collect information, assess that information, and then we get back together, and the exercise of weighing it and calibrating it is still comes back to me. I think it's important that you can't let go of your ability to make a judgment on a risk, because ultimately I'm making the recommendation to the CEO and I'm responsible. So the way I work with my team is to make sure there's an understanding about what's important, where to go find it, how to be creative in collecting more and more input, and then we get together and think about how to really synthesize what we've learned into an assessment that I will take as my own recommendation.
And do you have any tips on how you present that assessment?
Well, it's always good to have conviction and a well-reasoned opinion, because I think if you present a risky issue without a point of view, it's going to you just won't get anywhere and won't get any support for proceeding or not proceeding. You'll just be perceived to be wishy-washy and not have really embraced and dug into the situation. So I think having a clear point of view and a clear rationale as to how you develop that point of view and the breadth of investigation you put into it, I think those are the key things that you need to package up in a concise way to get your position to be understood.
And Denise, you had talked a little bit the other day, I think, about how important it was, kind of as Sheila was saying, to come to the table with a recommendation. Why do you feel like that's such a critical part of, delivering sort of a risk analysis?
I think it's important because you can't walk into a room and express concern or support for something without having a recommendation and a point of view. Someone told me early on in my career, don't just come with the problem, come with a suggested solution, right? And especially when you're looking at areas of risk, most people are uncomfortable either taking the risk or picking a side or choosing a route. So by going in there with a well-formulated opinion around what you think you should do, and more importantly, why, it immediately sets an air of confidence and also comfort for people, because risk is scary for anyone, and especially, for example, where I am, where it's a very long-term company as opposed to many of the startups that we see. They've been doing some things the same way. So when you just walk in and say, oh, we should try this innovative data product, that's not enough, right? You need to have the plan, the purpose, the expected outcome, so that people will look at you and say, okay, well, the risk is there, we understand it, but it's been thought out, and it just changes the whole tenor of the conversation.
So you've developed the framework, we have the manual, you've trained your team, you've analyzed the risk, and now you have bad news. Can you maybe share with us any personal experiences about what's the best way to share bad news?
I have to do this all the time. I mean, just to put things in context from my role, in my team in North America, we'll probably do 20 investments or acquisitions in a given year. We probably have 100 acquisitions that have come to us from, or investments that have come to us from people in our organization who are really good at what they do, really thinking creatively about the business, and have great ideas that they have asked us to review and vet and think about as capital decisions for the company. And so when I have to go back to those people and say, we're not going to proceed with your idea, that's bad news. And people fall in love with their ideas. So that's not a happy conversation from the outset. What I try to do is make sure I can really cleanly articulate the work that we've done, how we've developed our point of view, and why it's in the best interests of the company, even if it may not be in your particular piece of the company's best interest, why we're taking a view that we don't want to proceed. And I think if you can package that up and be consistent and rational and really, again, present ultimately why it's in the best interest of the company not to go ahead, you're really taking the higher ground, and people will want to keep working with you, and that's certainly been my experience.
Bad news is hard for everyone. I think sometimes it's even harder on the person delivering it than for the person receiving. But I think the most important thing you can do is deliver it clearly. In many cases, I've seen people deliver bad news, but they're not 100% clear. So the person receiving it walks away from the conversation either feeling unsure about what they were just told or feeling, oh, there's still a chance. And then it's even harder later on. So whenever you have to deliver bad news, I think the most important thing you can do is be clear that the answer is no, or that something didn't work. Provide substantial information about why you're giving that bad news, but also to be compassionate and understand, like Sheila said, people fall in love with their ideas and their projects, and in many ways it becomes their baby. And I think it's important to be respectful of that, because then that person will be more receptive to bad news this time, and they will trust you in the future to tell them where they really stand with something. And that's an important business relationship that you can carry forward.
And in person, email, post-it,
Text message. No.
text message.
No. Always in person.
Very
Facebook
modern.
message.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for being here with us today. We really appreciate you being part of this conversation and sharing your experiences with this entire group. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.